And just ahead on the Daily Debrief, violent flash mobs robbing stores and causing chaos in California. Is Governor Newsom's plan to fix the problem actually working, or does crime really pay? The details coming up. Plus, take a look at this, a Frontier flight making a fiery landing in Las Vegas on Saturday. The flight from San Diego to Vegas coming in for the landing when the pilots detected smoke and declared an emergency. Luckily, no one was hurt. The National Transportation Safety Bureau is investigating.
God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant fitting rest on the wings of the divine presence to the holy and pure, the brave, for the souls of the holy ones, men, women, and children who were killed on October 7th.
President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden holding a small ceremony to mark 1 year since the deadliest attack in Israel's history. On October 7th, 2023, the militant group Hamas killed 1,200 people and took 250 hostages. Israel's response has led to widespread criticism and concerns of a wider war in the Middle East. Washington correspondent Vinay Simlot explains.
The Israeli military says it intercepted rockets overnight and fired several more. U.S. officials have urged leaders in the Middle East to stop the fighting. At 6:29 a.m., the exact time Hamas launched the deadly surprise attack on Israel, the families of the nearly 400 people killed at the Nova Music Festival gathered to mourn. And outside the home of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, families of hostages still in Gaza called for their release. A 2-minute siren marked the time of the attacks. In all, Hamas, the militant group in Gaza, killed 1,200 Israelis and took some 250 people hostage into Gaza on October 7th, 2023. Israel's response since has displaced most of the 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza, and the Palestinian Health Ministry says the war in Gaza has killed more than 41,000. It doesn't differentiate between civilians and fighters. Fighting is expanding from Gaza to Israel's north in Lebanon. Overnight, Israel launched a new round of airstrikes in Beirut, targeting the Iranian-backed militia group Hezbollah. At least 1,400 Lebanese, including civilians and fighters, have been killed in Israeli attacks.
They have to be very much more careful about dealing with civilian casualties.
President Joe Biden has called for Israel to stop the fighting, but said Friday,
The Israelis have every right to respond to the vicious attacks on them.
In a new 60 Minutes interview, Vice President Kamala Harris again called for a deal that includes a ceasefire and for the hostages to be returned to Israel. For his part, former President Donald Trump has said that if he were president, October 7th never would have happened. In Washington, I'm Vinay Simlot. Back to you.
Thanks to Vinay Simlot for that report. Back here at home, colleges and universities across the country are bracing for demonstrations today after many campuses saw mass protests last spring, with students demanding their schools divest and break ties with companies that support Israel. Some of those protests did turn violent. At Columbia University's tensions came to a boiling point when students broke into and took control of Hamilton Hall on campus. Nearly 100 students were arrested when police cleared the building. Columbia University says the campus would host demonstrations Monday and extra security would be on hand. The Supreme Court returned to the bench Monday to start its new term, and already the court has made some news, declining to hear arguments into two controversial cases. Joining me now with the latest is the Hill's Courts reporter, Zach Schonfeld. So good to see you, Zach, as always. Look, I want to start out with this one abortion case in Texas. The court said earlier today that they wouldn't hear that case. What happened there, and why did the justices decline to hear it?
Hey, Julia. This case got a lot of attention, but the Supreme Court today declining to hear it without explanation. That is normal, but there had been a lot of attention on this because this is one of the major fronts in the fight on abortion after the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade. At issue here is a federal law called EMTLA, which provides that hospitals have to provide life-saving care to patients when they come into an emergency room, regardless of their ability to pay. The Biden administration has believed that this means that when there's in Republican states with a state abortion ban, if a woman comes into a hospital emergency room seeking emergency care and having a threat to her life, that hospital is still compelled to provide an emergency abortion even though there's a state ban on the books. So this case has gotten attention because last term there was a case arising from Idaho that the Supreme Court had taken up, but they tossed that case. They actually decided that they took it up too early. It came to them in a very unusual posture, and they actually expressed regret for taking it up. But this case in Texas that they declined to hear came to them through their normal process. So there had been anticipation that if the justices really wanted to get into this issue, this might be the vehicle to do it. But as you mentioned, they decided to not take up the case without explanation.
So I want to move to another issue, or another case, I should say. The court also declined to take up a challenge to Jack Smith's case against former President Trump. So what happened there?
This had to do with Jack Smith's warrant of Donald Trump's Twitter account. So back when he was investigating Trump, before he was actually charged in this case, this is the case in D.C. where he's charged with federal election interference, they issued a warrant, got a warrant against Trump's Twitter account that handed over his direct messages and all of his other account data. And Twitter had been trying to challenge this warrant. And also the fact that this warrant came along with a non-disclosure provision. So Twitter was actually prevented from even telling Donald Trump that they had turned over his data. And Elon Musk's Twitter had argued that they should get to have their First Amendment challenge in court before having to turn it over. They lost in lower courts, and just like the other case, the Supreme Court again decided to not take this up without explanation.
So we know that the election is just around the corner. Polling is showing a razor-thin race between Harris and Trump. Some are speculating that these results could be challenged in court. My mind automatically goes back to 2000, Florida, hanging chads, etc. Is the Supreme Court preparing for this? And if so, how are they preparing?
I think these justices, they're not living under a rock. They know what's on the horizon, that they might see these election cases come up. It's unclear at this point exactly how it's going to manifest itself, whether it's going to be about these lawsuits regarding mail-in ballots and misdated and undated ballots, whether it'll be these allegations about non-citizens voting, or, something more similar to the Bush v. Gore case with hanging chads. But I think the justices, they do seem prepared for whatever comes this way. Actually, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, she was on a book tour this summer and was asked if the Supreme Court was prepared, and she said yes, they were. So at this point, they're really just in a wait-and-see mode until November happens.
So in the meantime, what cases are you keeping an eye on over the next term?
Yeah, this term, compared to the last few that we've seen, it actually has fewer blockbuster cases compared to the terms of like affirmative action and then the like. That's not to say that there aren't any headliner cases. There are still a number of significant cases. So the first big case is actually headed to oral arguments tomorrow morning on Tuesday. And that case will involve the Biden administration's crackdown on ghost guns. These are DIY-type devices, usually compiled from a kit, and they're very difficult to trace. So the Biden administration has been very concerned about the increasing popularity of these devices. Officials say that in 2021 alone, there were more than 19,000 ghost guns seized. So the Biden administration is attempting to regulate them as if they were any other firearm. So this makes them subject to serial number requirements, purchases have to go through a background check, all of those types of requirements. So the Supreme Court's going to weigh in on whether that is a proper reading of federal law and whether the Biden administration is authorized to regulate them. Another big case we're watching later this term has to do with transgender rights. The Supreme Court is going to weigh in on these laws passed by Republican-led legislatures across the country about gender-affirming care for minors, these Republican states that have banned that care. So the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on whether that's constitutional. So a number of big cases already, but I'll just add that they're not done taking up cases for this term. So far, we have 43 cases on the docket, but when all is said and done, that number will probably be closer to about 60 or 70.
Wow, they're not done. We're in an election year. A lot to look out for. As always, Zach Schonfeld, thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you.
Los Angeles is reeling after two separate incidents over the weekend saw flash mobs descend on businesses and rob them. In one case, making off with more than $90,000 of merchandise. This latest spree comes after a month after Governor Newsom signed a law to enforce new penalties for smash and grab robberies. News Nation's Nancy Liu has the latest.
Julia, the most recent flash mob happened here inside this Nordstrom store, which has actually been hit before. This time, more than a dozen suspects, overwhelming mall security. Video of the Friday incident captured the adults and juveniles at work, all with some type of face covering, some in hooded sweatshirts, knocking over displays and running off with nearly $100,000 in luxury goods. The LAPD's organized retail crime task force responded quickly, identifying potential suspects from video images along with their getaway vehicles, and that led to 6 arrests over the weekend. But still no arrests in another violent weekend incident, this one in Anaheim, where a 7-Eleven clerk was no match against an even bigger flash mob. The store clerk suffered minor injuries in trying to prevent the robbery, but the group eventually broke through and stormed in to help themselves to liquor and food, ransacking the store. Some of them can be heard laughing on the way out. 7-Eleven stores are an ongoing target of flash mob robberies in Southern California. There have been more than a dozen similar incidents since July. So as you might expect, crime is a significant issue for California voters, many of whom are getting their mail-in ballots this week. On it is Prop 36, which would mean harsher punishment for repeat offenders. A new Berkeley LA Times survey shows 60% of Californians support a tougher approach, and that is spilling over into parenting. A number of recent 7-Eleven robberies, parents spotted their own children in these surveillance images and they turned them in to LAPD. Several teens are facing robbery charges. However, those mobs have sometimes involved up to 40 juveniles. In part, Prop 36 counters Prop 47 from 2014, and that raised the felony threshold for stolen merchandise to $950.
And that's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.